The hum of the humidifier hummed soft and steady in the dim nursery, mixing with the faint squeaky creak of the oak rocking chair beneath Elena Carter's weight. It was just past 9 on a Tuesday morning, 7 full days since she'd pushed her daughter Lila May into the world, 7 days since every raw, splitting ache of labor had seared itself into her memory like a brand. Sunlight filtered thin through linen blackout curtains, gilding the edge of the bassinet where her newborn slept swaddled in cream-knit blankets, tiny chest rising and falling in slow, fragile breaths. Elena's shoulders ached from hours of holding Lila through the night feedings, her lower abdomen still throbbing with leftover soreness from delivery, and the quiet of the ranch house felt heavy enough to press against her ribs. Jude had left an hour prior, rushing out to hit the big grocery store 20 minutes out of their Portland suburb to stock up on formula, diapers, and the electrolyte water her OB had insisted she drink non-stop for postpartum recovery. For the first stretch of the morning, it had been just her and the baby, a fragile piece she clung to like a lifeline. She'd barely closed her eyes for 10 minutes when sharp, rapid knocks bit into the front door, loud enough to rattle the wooden frame and make Lila stir with a thin whimper in the bassinet. Elena froze mid-sigh, one hand hovering over the crib rail to soothe her fussy daughter, a prickle of cold dread crawling up the back of her neck before she even moved toward the hallway. No one visited unannounced this early, not this soon after the birth. Her best friend Mara worked double shifts at the hospital birthing unit and texted hours ahead before dropping by. Neighbors stuck to casual waves across the lawn, and Jude had taken both house keys with. Only one person showed up without a single warning, without a text, without a call to check if she was even awake and stable enough for comfort. Elena's bare feet padded silently across the cool vinyl hallway floor, her postpartum hospital robe slipping off one shoulder as she dragged herself to the front entry. She paused for a beat beside the window beside the door, peeling back a sliver of the sheer curtain to peer. Carol Bennett stood on the front porch in her crisp floral blouse and pressed slap, a canvas tote bag slung over one arm stuffed with what Elena could only guess were cheap generic baby onesies from the discount grocery store where her mother had worked for 30 years. Her mother's mouth was set in the expectant line Elena had known since childhood, the look that said she believed she was owing, no matter how much pain she'd left her daughter drowning in only a week. Elena's throat tightened instantly, her mind snapping unbidden back to the night her contractions had spiked into unmanageable agony, the night she'd dialed her parents in a blind panic at 2 a.m., begging them to drive her the 10 minutes to the birth center. She'd sobbed through phone, voice cracking between sharp gaspings, telling Carol her water broken, that Jude's truck was in the shop for transmissions, that she had no other way to get to the hospital before her body fully gave out. Her mother sighed, loud and annoyed line, like Elena's emergency was nothing more than an inconvenient interruption to their planned steak dinner on the back. Roger's gruff voice had rumbled in the background, not a word of concern, only frustration at having his evening interrupted. Then Carol had spoken the words Elena would never erase from her head, flat, feeling, no trace of maternal care. Just, we aren't ruining our night running you down. No offer to reschedule dinner, no promise to meet at clinic, no quick check-in text to make sure she'd arrived safely after she'd hung up sobbing. Elena had fumbled through tears to book a rideshare that took 45 minutes to reach her house, curled on the cold entryway floor through 3 brutal contractions while she waited, alone, with no one to hold her hand or fetch her a glass of water. The driver had been a kind older woman who'd helped her carry her overnight bag in some unit, murmuring soft reassurances the entire ride, more compassion than her own flesh and blood had mustered for her in her darkest hour. Jude had caught an Uber from his mechanic's shop an hour to meet her, and he'd held her through every push, every tear, every quiet breakdown where she'd whispered that her own parents hadn't cared enough to. Now Carol on her porch, acting as if that never happened, as if she hadn't left her laboring daughter stranded and terrified to preserve a plate of grilled steak. Elena twisted the deadbolt slow, pulling the front door open only a narrow crack, enough to block the porch light from spilling in, and wing Lila fully. Carol's face up instantly, a performative warm smile stretched across her lips, as she shifted the tote bag forward. "Hi, honey?" she trilled, loud enough to carry the quiet nursery. "I couldn't wait another day to her. I picked up a few outfits for her, and I wanted to see how you're feeling labor." Elena cut her off before she finished the sentence, her voice cold, stripped of every ounce of the obligatory politeness she'd forced herself to use with her mother for 32 years. She didn't raise her voice, didn't nap or scream, just stared straight into Carol's stunned, hopeful eyes, and let the words land heavy between them on the front porch. "What, baby?" Carol faltered instantly, sliding off her face like melted wax, her eyebrows shooting upward in pure, uncomprehending shock. Took one step forward, hand raised as if to the door wider, and Elena planted her firm against the wood, to budge an inch. "Don't be ridiculous, Elena," Carol huffed, her tone sharpening into the familiar guilt-tripping edge Elena's life. "I know you could be 7 days ago. The whole neighborhood's been and they'll get to see her. I've been telling everyone how excited we were to grandbaby. Were you excited when I called you begging hospital?" Elena interrupted. The memory of that lonely night burned her eyes. "When I was doubled over floor in active labor, and you told me to order instead of helping me." "Where was that excitement then?" Color flooded Carol's cheek, red and defensive, her hands tightening around the straps of her toque until her knuckles whitened. That was a different situation. You're overreacting. We had plans that night. This on us out of nowhere. And to exist for a reason. A taxi was not supposed to be my lifeline when I was having your Elena said. Her chest tight with suppressed sobs she let fall in front of her mother. Left me alone in an emergency. You chose your dinner over me. Now you show up here unannounced, acting like none of it ever happened. Expecting to walk right in and hold my daughter after you abandoned me when I needed you most. So I'll ask you again, who are you here to see? Carol sputtered, opening and closing her mouth without forming a coherent sentence, hurt and warring across her features. She took a step back from the door, fake warmth gone entirely, replaced by bitter resentment. This is ungrateful, Elena. After everything your father and I have done for you over the years, you're holding one inconvenient night against us and shutting us out of our granddaughter's lives on her. One inconvenient night, Elena repeated hollowly, turning her gaze back toward the nursery where Lila's soft drifted down the hallway. That's all my labor was to convenience. Before Carol fire back another sharp retort, Elena eased the door closed a fraction, her fingers wrapping around the brass doorknob to slide the deadbolt back. She didn't slant. Slow, quiet, a deliberate boundary set in stone between them. The last thing she caught sight of was Carol's furious, betrayed expression as the wood panel slid shut, muffled porch. Elena leaned her forehead against the painted door for a long minute. Hands shaking as she fought to steady her ragged breathing. Tears pricked the corner of her eyes, hot and stinging, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give Carol the satisfaction of seeing the damage she'd caused. She turned away from the entryway, padding back down the hallway to the nursery, where Lila had woken fully, small fists balled up as she fussy cries for her mother. Elena sank back into the rocking chair, lifting her daughter gentle against her chest, the weight of the newborn warm and solid against her heart, a tangible reminder of the life she was determined to protect, from the same emotion carried since childhood. She'd only settled against her shoulder and started slow, soothing rocking motions when her cell phone buzzed nonstop on the wooden nightstand beside the bassinet, screen lighting over and over with incoming text messages. Elena glanced down long enough to catch the glowing bright white display. Roger Bennett, her father. The first few preview lines of his message blared accusatory, furious words, already taking Carol's side, before Elena had even told her on the front porch. The driveway crunched with gravel a minute later as Carol's sedan peeled away fast. Elena left her father's unread texts blinking on the nursery nightstand all through mid-morning, refusing to unlock her phone and let Roger's rage seep into the small bubble of calm she'd built with Lila. She'd muted all notifications from both her parents' hours. Before Jude rolled back into the driveway with overflowing grocery bags, paper sacks crinkling as he hauled them inside and spotted her hollow, red-rimmed eyes the second he stepped past the threshold. He didn't need to ask what had happened. The tight, defeated slump of her shoulders told him everything before she spoke a single word, and he set the supplies down fast across the living room and pulled her into a slow, careful hug that avoided her sore abdomen. She buried her face against his flannel work shirt, the faint scent of pine sawdust wrapping around her, and recounted the porch confrontation in quiet, broken fragment. Carol's unannounced knock, the tote full of cheap baby clothes, the way her mother's performative warmth had curdled into spite. The second Elena's, "What, babe?" Jude's jaw clenched tighter with every detail, his hands rubbing slow circles over her back as she repeated the line her parents had tossed at her mid-labor, like her emergency had been nothing more than a minor nuisance. "They won't let this stop," Jude said once she'd finished singing, glancing toward the front window where tire tracks still marked the gravel from Carol's hasty act. "Your mom hates feeling like she's lost control of a situation, and this grandbaby is her new favorite topic for every neighborhood. She's not just upset about the door. She's upset you stripped her of the perfect grandmother narrative she's been building for." Elena pulled away from his embrace to glance at, now sound asleep, swaddled on the living room couch beneath a thin knit kit. She'd spent the rest of the morning drafting short, measured text to both Carol and Roger, laying out gentle boundaries she'd hoped might defuse them. Any visit to Lila required advanced text. Jude had to be present the entire time, and all conversation would avoid rehashing the night she'd gone in labor. She'd triple-checked every line to keep the tone neutral. No sharp accusations, just simple rules to keep her postpartum space. She sent it off while Jude unpacked papers, hitting send with quiet hope that her parents read it and choose compromise. That hope dissolved noon. By 1 o'clock, Elena there, and she arranged to meet Mara at the small downtown coffee shop 10 minutes from the leaving Lila home with Jude while she drove alone. The cafe hummed with soft jazz and quiet chatter from other week hoppers, sunlight slanting through floor-to-ceiling windows as she slid into a vinyl booth across from her. Mara wore faded hospital scrubs under an oversized cardigan, fresh off an overnight shift at the wing, and her face softened the second she saw the exhaustion etched into Elena's features. Mara listened without interruption as Elena walked through the morning's fight and showed her the boundary text, along with the furious replies that had flooded her inbox minutes after sending it. Carol's messages leaned hard on guilt, listing every small favor she claimed to have done for Elena. Framing the labor taxi incident as a one-time slip-up Elena was blowing out. Roger's texts were shorter, gruffer, demanding she stop punishing them for mistake, and threatening to stop helping with any future household repairs they'd offered. "It's one mistake," Mara said, sliding her iced latte aside to lean forward across the table, her voice firm. "I worked that night shift you labor. I watched that rideshare driver carry your bag through the lobby alone while you couldn't. I held your hand while you sobbed about how no one from your family cared enough to show up. That's not a trivial inconvenience." She paused, tilting her head as a thought her mind, pulling out her own phone through Facebook. "Speaking of your mom, have you paged lately?" Lena shook her head, reaching for her own device and pulling up Carol's profile. Her stomach sank the second the feed loaded. Dozens of recent posts lined the timeline, all featuring generic stock photos of swaddled newborns pulled straight from the image sites. Carol had captioned each one with glowing lines about her lighted granddaughter, writing paragraphs about being present in his labor, holding the baby hours after delivery, gushing about late-night feedings she'd supposedly sat through. Neighbors and distant relatives flooded the comment section with congratulations, none of them aware Carol hadn't laid eyes on even once, let alone sat beside her. "Shang to everyone," Elena whispered, scrolling faster through the posts, a cold knot in her chest. "She's building this whole perfect grandma persona online while she left me stranded." Mara nodded, scrolling down to reveal a post from 3 days prior announcing a neighborhood baby shower Carol claimed to be 3 weeks. A celebration meant to welcome it grandgirl. No text. No call to run past Elena. Her mother had booked a venue deposit without a single consultation, treating Lila like a decorative prop for her social circle instead of her vulnerable newborn daughter. "All of it's about reputation," Mara explained, her hands on the table. "Your mom does about how hurt you are. She cares that the whole street thinks she's a devoter and grandmother. And your refusal to that image." Elena left the coffee shop and out, her head spinning, driving home through tree-lined suburban streets while her mind raced over every Carol had posted, every guilt-laden text her parents had sent her that afternoon. When she got back through the front door, Jude sat on the couch with her spread open between them, scrolling through the Facebook posts one by one as arms. He'd read every exchange between Elena and her parents, his expression tight on her behalf. "We can't let her keep writing these false stories," Jude said, back to Elena. "If she wants to host a shower, she talks to us first. She doesn't get to rent out a venue and parade our baby around for clout without with it." Elena sat onto the couch beside him, resting her head on his shoulder and staring at the screen where Carol's stared back. She typed out a follow-up text addressing both the social media lies and the unapproved shower plans, asking her mother to take down the stock infant posts and cancel the venue deposit until they could discuss a celebration together as a family. She hit send, setting the phone down on the cushion beside her, and waited what she knew was inevitable. Arrived 10 minutes later. A single long message from Carol that landed on Elena's chest. Bolded text standing out against the dim screen as Elena flipped the phone back over to it. The words were clear, uncompromising, a blunt ultimatum with no room for negotiation. Either Elena let Carol and Roger come over that Saturday afternoon to hold Lila out a list of restrictive rules, or they would cut with her entirely. No more calls, no more visits. They'd wash their hands of their daughter and granddaughter for good if she refused to drop her bound act as they pleased. Elena locked the screen, setting the phone aside and reaching out to Lila against her chest, the baby slightly at the shift of movement, tiny fingers round Elena's thumb. Outside the living room window, the sun dipped low the oak trees lining their street, soft golden light. Stared down at her sleeping daughter. 2 impossible choices. Surrender the hard boundaries she'd to protect herself and her newborn, or risk losing her parents completely for standing her ground. Elena's thumb hovered over the reply box for nearly an hour after Carol's ultimatum landed, the weight of the choice pressing heavy behind her ribs. She glanced down at Lila, swaddled warm against her chest, the baby's soft, even breaths quieting the sharp panic that had coiled tight in her stomach the second she finished reading her mother's threat. Surrender meant opening her front door Saturday and letting Carol and Roger walk all over every line she'd drawn to protect her fragile postpartum peace. It meant pretending the taxi labor incident had never wounded her, letting them parade Lila around like a prize to fix their damaged neighborhood reputation. To refuse meant risking permanent estrangement, a loss that still stung even after decades of quiet neglect. Jude knelt beside the couch, one hand resting light on her knee as he read the text over her shoulder, his jaw hardening with every sentence of Carol's ultimatum. He didn't push her to answer right away, just waited until she'd exhaled a shaky breath before speaking, his voice steady and unshakable. "You don't owe them unfiltered access to our daughter to keep their attention, Elena. That ultimatum isn't love, it's manipulation. They're banking on you being scared enough to cave, to erase your pain, just so they don't have to face the consequences of how they treated you in labor." His words settled something sharp and tangled inside her, and Elena typed out her response slowly, every sentence deliberate and calm. No raised accusations, only unyielding rules. She told Carol and Roger she would not drop her boundary list for a rushed Saturday visit, restating that all meetings required advance notice, her husband's full presence, and ground rules banning rehashing old fights or pushing for the unapproved neighborhood shower. She added that if they wanted to build a gentle relationship with Lila, they would need to respect her terms. Threats of cutting contact only proved they cared more about getting their own way than healing the rift between them. She hit send, flipped her phone face down, and pushed it far to the edge of the coffee table, determined not to check for replies until Lila's next. By mid-afternoon, the house phone began ringing nonstop, shrill rings cutting through the quiet nursery every few minutes. Elena ignored the first 3 calls, certain it was her parents. But on the 4th ring, Jude lifted the receiver, listened for 30 seconds, then handed the phone to her with a weary, tight expression. It was her Aunt Marnie, Carol's older sister, her voice thick with the same guilt Elena had grown accustomed to hearing from her mother's side of the Marnie had only heard Carol's one-sided version of the portrait, the fake Facebook grandbaby stories, and the No one had bothered to pass along the full story of Elena stranded in her, alone and terrified, begging for a ride that never. Your mother's heartbroken over. Marnie sighed down, loud enough that Elena could hear background chatter from a family barbecue at her aunt. All she wants is to hold that baby. You're being cruel shutting them out before they've even met their daughter. This whole family's talking about how ungrateful you. Elena gripped the footer, frustration burning hot behind her eyes as she tried to explain the night of labor, only for Marnie to cut her off mid-sentence. Already set on siding with Carol without hearing the truth. By the time she hung the call, 3 more missed voicemails waited each from distant cousins and great aunts she rarely spoke to, all repeating. She needed to forgive her parents and let them see Lila without. The extended family circle had already paid, and Elena realized with a hollow ache that none of them would pause to ask for her side of the story. That evening, after Lila had fallen asleep for a long stretch, Elena sat at the kitchen counter with Jude, scrolling through Carol's Facebook page again as frustration. The stock baby photos still crowded the top of her timeline, dozens of neighbors leaving congratulatory comments, fully fooled by the fabricated narrative Carol had built to hide her abandonment of Elena. Without a word, Elena tapped into the settings menu and blocked both Carol and Roger's account on her feed, cutting off their ability to flood her with misleading posts and public performative grandmother content. It was a small defensive barrier, but every little wall she built around herself and Lila felt necessary to breathe through the constant family harassment. Jude wrapped an arm around her waist as she stared at the blocked account screen, his chest pressing gently. Her line to draw. You shouldn't have to scroll through her lies every day while you're recovering from birth and born. He paused, glancing at the stack of unread guilt-tripping texts still sitting in message inbox. If their harassment doesn't slow down, we can look into booking a licensed family therapist to mediate talk on them. A neutral third party might help them see how much. Elena nodded, the thought of guided mediation a faint glimmer of hope in the chaos. But the calm didn't last long. An hour later, Jude's personal cell phone heard from the living room, Roger's name lighting up the screen. He stepped outside onto the front to take the call, closing the glass door behind him to keep the knocking Lila. But Elena still heard the sharp, raised timbre of her father's voice drifting through the thin glass panels. 10 minutes passed before Jude stepped back inside, his face white with restrained anger, and set his phone hard on the table. Roger just threatened to cut you entirely out of the family trust fund they've been building for decades, Jude told her flatly, sitting down beside her at the counter and sliding his phone across so she could read the follow-up text Roger had sent after the call. The man spelled it out plainly. Comply with their demand for an unrestricted visit to meet Lila, or forfeit any claim to the savings and property Roger and Carol planned to leave passed away. It was a cold, calculated financial threat, another weapon they wielded to force her into abandoning her boundaries. Elena seemed numb. She'd never cared about the inheritance, never counted on their money or her family. But the fact her own father would weaponize their finances to punish her for protecting her new daughter left a bitter, heavy weight settling in her bones. She glanced toward the nursery door, where soft, sleepy gurgles drew out from Lila's bassinet, and her arms around herself, fighting the urge to cave just to end the endless stream of threats and guilt from every corner of her mother's family. Jude laced his fingers through hers, squeezing gently to ground her as the weight of Roger's ultimatum sank in fully. The trust isn't worth sacrificing our daughter and your peace of mind. If they're willing to dangle money for your head to make you bend, aren't acting out of love. Not for you, not for Lila. What I said about therapy. We'll schedule a consultation first thing tomorrow, before they have threats. Elena head against his shoulder, listening to his quiet sounds down the hall, knowing the quiet reprieve would not last. Her parents had moved past guilt trips and social media lies to tame financial retaliation, and every layer of pressure they piled on only pushed the divide between them ever been before. The gentle middle ground she'd once hoped to find with Roger was vanishing fast, swallowed whole by their refusal to acknowledge the pain it caused her 7 days prior, the night they'd told her to call a cab while she labored alone. Elena spent the following morning staring at the therapist's contact page Jude had pulled up on his laptop, the cursor blinking over the book consultation button, while Lila dozed against her chest. She'd replayed Aunt Marnie's guilt-laden phone call dozens of times overnight, a nagging, foolish thought looping in the back of her mind. What if she'd spoken softer, explained her hurt more gently, and won her aunt over to her side. If one family member understood why she'd shut Carol out, maybe the rest of the relatives would stop blowing up her phone with lectures and judgment. Against Jude's quiet warning that the Bennett side rarely kept private grievances confidential, she unlocked her cell and dialed Marnie's number, stepping out onto the shaded back patio to talk where Lila's nap wouldn't be disturbed. The backyard air smelled of cut grass and jasmine, a faint breeze stirring the outdoor furniture cushions as Elena walked the aunt through every raw, unfiltered detail she'd held back during their first call. She described the 2 a.m. panic of her water breaking, Jude's broken truck, the shaky sobs that had torn through her chest mid-contraction while Carol brushed her off for steak dinner, the 45-minute wait for a rideshare while she collapsed on her entryway floor. She told Marnie about the fake stock baby photos flooding Carol's Facebook feed, the unapproved shower venue deposit, the ultimatum to cut all contact, and Roger's cruel threat to strip her of the family inheritance. For 20 minutes, Elena laid bare every wound her parents had left fresh and bleeding, clinging to the fragile hope that her mother's sister would finally see things from her perspective. Marnie made sympathetic humming noises through most of the story, soft enough that Elena allowed herself a tiny flicker of relief, convinced she'd found an unbiased ear within the family. She ended the call, promising to text Marnie screenshots of Carol's misleading social media posts then wandered back inside to check on Lila, relieved to have unburdened herself to someone she'd thought knew. That relief evaporated less than an hour later, when a flood of frantic, angry texts exploded across her lock, all forwarded straight from Marnie to every vulnerable confession Elena had shared twisted into ammunition against her. Carol's incoming messages arrived rapidly. Paragraphs of outrage claiming Elena had spent hours bad-mouthing her and Roger to the whole thing, painting them as cruel, heartless grandparents over a single minor inconvenience. Marnie had not just relayed the privacy. She'd added her own critical, writing that Elena was blowing a small dinner interruption into lifelong, and urging Carol to stand firm against her unreasonable. Elena's hands shook as she scrolled through the forward head, a cold wave of betrayal washing over her. There was no neutral ground among her mother's, no safe person to trust with. Every family member carried loyalty to Carol first, no matter the truth of what had happened the night she went into labor. By dinner time, Elena's resolve frayed thin under the constant barrage of judgment. Jude caught her staring blankly at Lila's bassinet while wiping down counters, her thumb hovering over a text draft that softened all her visitation rules, a quiet crack showing in the strength she'd held onto for 3 years running. She admitted she'd briefly considered stripping away every boundary just to make the endless family harass stop. Tired of being labeled ungrateful and bitter by people who'd never stopped to ask how terrified she'd been alone in labor, Jude leaned against the chair beside her, turning off the running tap so he could hold steady. No trace of frustrated tone, only "I get how exhausting this is," he said, reaching out to brush a strand of messy postpartum hair. "It's human to crave quiet, to want the phone to stop ringing and the texts to stop burning. But bending every rule just to avoid conflict doesn't fix anything. It teaches them their threats and trips work, and next time they'll push even harder for more control." Elena was right, but loneliness gnawed at her anyway. Mara was stuck covering double shifts at the hospital birthing unit for the 2 days, too swamped with emergency deliveries to stop by, or even a long phone call, leaving Elena without her only fully loyal con. The house felt far too quiet without her best friend's perspective, and the weight of being the sole villain in the Bennett family's narrative pressed heavier with her. She pulled out her phone to video Mara anyway, catching her between patient rounds in the clinic break room, the nurse's scrubs streaked with faint hospital sanitizer and exhaustion etched deep beneath her eyes. Mara listened to the story of Marnie's betrayal, her expression hardening as Elena read snippets of the forwarded texts aloud. She didn't waste energy telling Elena she'd been her aunt. Instead, she validated the sharp hurt of having her private traumas against her, reminding her that family blood didn't automatically equal safety or kindness. Mid-conversation, Mara dropped another devastating piece of information uncovered yet. Carol had already paid a non-refundable deposit for the neighbor baby shower venue, locked in it 3 weeks away, and printed stacks of paper invitations without running a single detail for Jude. The mother planned to fill her home with every cousin, aunt, neighbor, and church acquaintance she knew, using Lila as the centerpiece of a celebration designed to erase the shame of abandoning her daughter during labor. Shortly after Elena ended the video call with Mara, a photo text popped on her screen from Carol, unprompted and unapologetic. The image showed rows of pastel pink shower streamers, printed banners emblazoned with "Well, grandbaby Lila," and a stack of sealed invitations stacked on the room table. The accompanying text left no room for compromise, sharp and final, the ultimatum sharper than the threat that had come before it. Carol wrote that Elena was expected to bring Lila to the shower on the Saturday afternoon, fully present for every guest conversation. If she refused to attend with the baby, Carol vowed to cut all contact permanently and spend every family gathering recounting how Elena had cruelly kept her own parent granddaughter. Elena sank onto the living room couch, pulling Lila into her arms as the newborn stirred awake with whimpers. She stared at the shower decoration glowing on her phone screen, her chest tight with clarity. This had never been about Carol's granddaughter. The shower was a performance, a public spectacle her mother intended to stage to rewrite the truth of that lonely labor night for every urban community. Elena showed up with Lila. Every guest would leave convinced Carol had been a devoted, supportive grandmother from the start. Oblivious to the taxi call, the 45-minute rideshare wait, the cold choice to prioritize a steak dinner over her daughter's life-or-death emergency 7 days after Lila's birth. If she stayed home, she'd be painted as a bitter, unforgiving outcast for years to come. No middle path existed. No gentle compromise that wouldn't cost her either her daughter's safety or her own reputation within the family circle. Elena pressed her forehead lightly on top of Lila's fuzzy head, the baby's fist curling around her finger, and realized every misstep she made, trusting her aunt, softening her boundaries, hoping for sick empathy from Carol and Roger, had only handed her parents more leverage to twist her own social gain. The ground beneath her had shifted entirely, and the worst of the family con was beginning to unfold. The gray light of early dawn seeped through the nursery curtains before Elena slept more than 2 fitful hours that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she replayed Marnie's betrayal, the forwarded texts twisting her most vulnerable labor memories into cruel gossip. And Carol's unshakable plan for the neighborhood shower loomed at the back of her mind like a storm cloud. Jude had left before sunrise for an early construction bid meeting, leaving her alone with Lila, and the quiet weight of knowing every blood relative on her mother's side was aligned against her. She'd spent weeks shoving a dusty cardboard storage box beneath the master bedroom floorboards after moving into the ranch, a forgotten relic from her teenage years she'd not touched since before her pregnancy, and restlessness pulled her toward it while the baby dozed in the bassinet. She knelt beside the bedroom closet, pried loose the loose oak floorboard with a butter knife from the kitchen, and dragged the faded cardboard box out into the carpet. Inside sat a leather-bound journal, its cover scuffed at the edges, pages filled with messy teenage handwriting she'd thought she'd buried forever. Elena carried it to the rocking chair beside Lila's crib, flipping open the front cover, and the first entry hit her chest like a heavy stone. 14 years old, sick with a 103-degree fever, begging Carol to take her to urgent care after school, only to be told to tough it out because her mother's bridge club started in an hour. Page after page unfolded a repeating pattern she'd spent decades refusing to name. Every childhood emergency set aside for Carol's social plan, every quiet cry for comfort brushed off as overreaction. Every milestone Elena celebrated alone while her parents prioritized their dinner, their friends, their public image over her suffering. The taxi incident during labor wasn't a one-off mistake. It was just the latest chapter in a lifelong cycle of emotional abandonment she'd carried alone her whole life. She read for nearly 2 hours, tracing old ink smudges left by teenage teens, while Lila slept undisturbed against a folded blanket on her. By the time she closed the journal's cover, a cold clarity settled over. She'd spent years hoping Carol and Roger might grow softer with age, might finally offer the care she'd craved as a lonely kid, but their choice to leave her stranded in labor proved that hope had always been empty. She tucked the journal on the nightstand instead of hiding it back under the floorboards, a quiet promise to herself that she would no longer minimize their cruelty to spare their feelings. Mid-morning brought a text alert from Mara, shortened. Her nurse coworker had spotted Carol's sedan parked in the visitor lot of Elena's pediatric clinic, where Elena was due for a routine 6-week postpartum check-in later that afternoon. Mara warned her mother had lingered by the front entrance for over 20 minutes, clearly waiting to corner her the second she stepped out of the exam rooms. Elena's stomach twisted at the thought of a public confrontation, but she'd already confirmed the appointment weeks prior to clear her return to part-time work, and canceling last minute would only let Carol claim Elena was. She left Lila with a trusted neighborhood babysitter the street, grabbed tote bag, and drove the short stretch to the clinic with the leather journal tucked beside her water bottle in the pack. The clinic parking lot bustled with families and staff, minivans lined along the curbs, the hum of the building's AC drifting out through glass. Elena had barely locked her car door when Carol stepped out from behind a concrete planter full of olds, her expression tight and confrontational, no trace of the fake warm grandmother smile she wore for neighbors and social media posts. She marched straight across the asphalt to block Elena's path toward the doors, voice raised loud enough that passing parents and nurses turned their heads to watch the exchange unfold. "You think you can hide behind doctors and babysitters to avoid me?" Carol snapped, arms crossed hard her chest, her floral purse swinging against her hip as she leaned forward. "I've had to listen to every cousin and neighbor ask why I still haven't met my daughter, all because you're holding a single inconvenient night against me like some light. Hand me that baby this weekend, or I will keep showing up here every single day until you stop this child." Elena's throat tightened, postpartum anxiety spiking sharp as strangers' eyes lingered on them. She kept her voice calm and level, refusing to match Carol's raised volume even as her hands trembled. "This isn't a grudge night, Mom. It's 32 years of you putting this before me, starting when I was a sick teenager waiting for a ride to the doctor, and ending when I were alone, begging for help. You can't ambush me at my workplace and demand access to Lila after you left me stranded." Carol scoffed loud, rolling her eyes and closer, unconcerned with the growing awe of clinic staff. "You're twisting every small thing from your childhood to justify being cruel now. I sacrificed so much raising you. This is the thanks I get. You lock me out of my grandbaby's life and spread terrible lies about to the whole family." Mara appeared through the glass doors a minute later, fresh off a slow shift in the hospital birthing wing. and stepped firmly between Elena and to create space. Her professional nurse's tone steady but unyielding. "This is a medical facility, Ms. Bennett. Public harassment of staff and permitted here. If you wish to discuss family matters with Elena, schedule a private conversation on her terms. Not ambush her on clip she works." Carol's face flushed red with humiliation as more co-workers stepped out into the lot to witness the argument. She shot Elena one final venomous glare before spinning on her heel and storming back to her sedan, slamming the car door so rattled. Elena's chest heaved, a panic attack creeping up fast as her vision blurred at the edges, and Mara wrapped an arm around her shoulders to guide her into the quiet staff break room, fetch her a cold glass of water and a mint from the front desk to steady her racing heart. Once Elena's breathing slowed, Mara sat across the linoleum break room table and listened as Elena pulled the older journal out of her bag. Flipping open to the childhood entries that laid bare the pattern of neglect stretching back decades, the nurse nodded slowly, confirming it all along. Carol's refusal to help during labor was a spontaneous mistake. It was instinct, a lifetime habit of prioritizing her own comfort over her daughter's pain. By the time Elena finished her postpartum exam and drove home to retrieve Lila from the babysitter, she'd made a football decision. That evening, she pulled up the directory for licensed family therapy within their Portland suburb, scrolling through provider bios until she found one specializing in intergenerational emotional neglect and postpartum family conflict. She filled out the intake form online and booked a solo consultation appointment for 3 days later, fully aware Carol and Roger would agree to join a joint session, unwilling to face accountability for repeated failures as parents. Night fell soft over the neighborhood as Elena looked Lila in the nursery, the old leather journal open up beside the bassinet, its pages illuminated the glow of the table lamp. She pressed a gently to the top of her daughter's head, the journal's worn cover, a heavy, weary truth settling in her bones. Therapy might give her the word back her lifelong trauma, but it could never erase the years of loneliness Carol and Roger had handed her. The midpoint crisis of the clinic parking lot ambush had stripped away the last faint hope that her parents would apologize unprompted, or recognize how deeply they'd wounded her. Elena brushed a soft finger over Lila's sleeping cheek, the quiet nursery with unspoken fear. Even with professional guidance to untangle the generational haunts down from her mother's side, she had no way of knowing or break the cycle for her daughter, not while Carol and Roger continued to chase control, social clout, and their own comfort at every cost. The road ahead promised nothing but harder fights, deeper heartache, and endless pressure to surrender the boundaries she'd built to protect both herself and the fragile newborn curled safe in her arms. The hum of the nursery humidifier felt thinner, emptier the morning of Elena's solo therapy session, as if the house itself had absorbed every ounce of her quiet dread overnight. Jude had pulled mandatory overtime for 2 full weeks, a last-minute commercial construction bid that demanded dawn-to-dusk shifts 6 days straight, leaving Elena to navigate feedings, colicky spells, and non-stop family harassment with only fleeting text check-ins from her husband between job site inspections. Mara had texted earlier that week to warn she'd been assigned emergency night rotations through the weekend, stuck covering unexpected labor surges at the hospital birthing wing. No quick coffee meetups, no long venting calls, no steady buffer against the weight pressing down on Elena's shoulders. For the first time since Lila's birth, she was truly alone to carry every thread of the conflict with Carol and Roger. She logged into the virtual therapy portal 10 minutes early, the leather teenage journal propped open beside her laptop on the living room coffee table, its pages marked with dog-eared entries detailing decades of unmet need. The therapist, a calm middle-aged woman specializing in postpartum generational trauma, walked her gently through the layers of hurt that stretched far beyond the night Elena had begged for a ride to the birthing center. She named the pattern plainly for Elena: chronic emotional neglect. A parent's consistent choice of personal convenience over their child's safety and distress, a cycle handed down through Carol's own upbringing that she had unthinkingly repeated with her daughter. For an hour, Elena unpacked the clinic parking lot ambush, Marnie's betrayal, the fake social media baby post, the inheritance theft, and the looming mandatory neighborhood shower Carol refused to cancel. Each confession loosening a knot she'd clamped tight in her chest since labor. By the end of the video call, Elena had a new vocabulary for the pain she'd long dismissed as overreacting or ungratefulness. But clarity did little to soften the isolation settling heavy over the ranch house. Once the therapist window closed, her cell phone lit up with a backlog of voicemail notifications. A dozen unheard messages stacked from Carol and Roger that she'd avoided listening to for 3 days. She sank onto the couch. Lila swaddled quiet against her chest and hit play on the first ring, her mother's sharp, wounded tone flooding the speaker. Carol lamented the wasted money on shower deposits, accused Elena of robbing them of a grandchild bond every other family got to pay, and insisted the taxi incident had been blown wildly out of proportion. Roger's messages were shorter, filled with reminders of all the money they'd spent on Elena growing up, framing every boundary she'd set as a personal insult to everything they'd ever sacrificed for her. She listened to each one all the way through, her throat burning with suppressors, before muting the voicemail inbox entirely and tossing her phone across the ocean. The quiet of the empty house closed in around her without Jude's steady hands or Mara's grounded perspective. She'd spent years convincing herself she'd outgrown the childish ache for her parents' unconditional. But the endless flood of guilt-laced harassment stripped that armor away. Late that evening, after Lila finally settled into a 3-hour stretch of sleep, Elena wandered into the master bathroom and stared at her reflection in the floor. Raw exhaustion etched on eyes, and admitted the ugly truth she'd hidden even. All desperate part of her still craved Carol's approval, still ached to hear her mother say she'd been wrong to leave her laboring alone, still hoped for the gentle maternal care she'd never received as a girl. That crack in her resolve lingered. When Mara managed a 5-minute video call between hospital rounds, the nurse could spot the wavering fragility in Elena's posture the second the camera turned on. Mara's voice was thick with weariness from back-to-back deliveries, but her tone firm, refusing to let Elena spiral into self-blame for holding. She reminded Elena that craving parental love did not mean surrendering her safety, that the longing for a better mother-daughter was human, yet it did not erase the harm Carol and Roger had repeated. The call cut short when a code blue alert blared over Mara's pager, leaving Elena alone once more with her tangled concerns. The following afternoon, Elena sat at the kitchen table with pen, paper, and every screenshot of manipulative texts, fake Facebook posts, and inheritance threats per. She drafted a formal boundary letter, typed clean and printed on thick white stationery, laying out every uncrossable line without yelling. Advance written note all visits, mandatory presence of for every meeting, zero discussion of the unapproved neighborhood shower inside her home. A clear statement that she would not attend the celebration Carol planned to stage as a public purpose without full, honest conversation about the night she'd gone into labor. She wrote that she remained open to limited contact once Carol and Roger acknowledged their choice to abandon her during labor and committed to trauma. But every threat, ambush, and lie had eroded any she'd once held that they could beat her and Lila, basic compassion. When the final paragraph was signed and sealed inside a white envelope, Elena slid it into her canvas crossbody bag and sat on the entryway bench, ready to deliver it to her parents' suburban home first thing tomorrow morning. She paced the empty living room long after had fallen asleep, glancing repeatedly at the sealed letter by the front door, a cold weight of certain in her stomach. Hand-delivering that note meant laying every hard truth directly at Roger's feet, stripping away every chance for vague, half-hearted compromise for weeks. There would be no more room to pretend the fear had been minor, no more space for them to twist her quiet requests into cruelty or ingratitude. Elena wandered back to the nursery, sinking into the creaky oak rocking chair and brushing a soft finger over Lila's sleeping forehead. The faint rise and fall of the baby's chest, the only steady, gentle thing in a world frayed in by family conflict. She glanced over at the sealed envelope visible through the arch and a sharp, haunting question would answer. Once the letter landed in Carol's hands tomorrow, parents choose to listen. Or would they burn every remaining thread of their daughter's relationship to protect their own pride and perfect public reputation? No amount of therapy, no list of carefully worded boundaries, no love for her baby could erase the fear that tomorrow's quiet delivery would mark the permanent end of the only family she'd ever been born into. Dawn seeped pale gray through the oak trees lining Carol and Roger's quiet residential street when Elena pulled into their empty curb parking spot the next morning, the sealed boundary letter tucked tight inside her crossbody bag. Lila was strapped securely into her rear-facing car seat, still swaddled and sound asleep after an early feeding, and Elena took a slow, grounding breath before stepping out onto the cracked concrete sidewalk. She'd woken hours before sunrise, replaying every line of the letter in her head, every carefully laid rule, every quiet account of lifelong neglect, every demand for basic accountability over the night. She'd labored alone, and her hands trembled faintly as she walked up the concrete front steps of her parents' single-story ranch. No cars sat in their driveway, a small stroke of relief. She had no intention of lingering for a screaming confrontation before she was ready, only to leave the envelope on their weathered wooden porch mat beneath a ceramic potted marigold Carol had tended for years. She knelt down, slid the letter flat against the welcome mat, and stood back for a beat, scanning the front windows, half expecting to catch a glimpse of her mother watching from behind the sheer curtains. The house stayed silent, no movement behind the glass, and Elena turned quickly to retreat to her own vehicle, climbing back behind the wheel and pulling away without a single backward glance. For a fleeting second, she allowed herself to hope the written words might sink in without immediate retaliation, that Carol and Roger might read through every page and recognize the depth of the pain they'd handed her over 32 years. That fragile hope dissolved by late afternoon. Jude texted to say he'd wrapped his construction site inspections early and was heading home an hour ahead of schedule, promising to pick up takeout soup Elena craved for her postpartum soreness. And Elena had just settled Lila into the living room bassinet when headlights cut across her front lawn. She peered through the kitchen window to spot her parents' faded blue pickup truck rumbling to a harsh stop beside her driveway gate, Carol throwing open the passenger door before the vehicle had fully rolled to rest. Roger cut the engine and followed close behind. The crumpled white boundary letter clutched tight in his fist, its envelope ripped open along one side as if Carol had torn it apart the second she'd spotted it on their porch that morning. Elena's heart leapt, and she reached for her cell to shoot Jude an urgent text, warning him her parents had arrived unannounced and furious. her fingers fumbling slowly as she typed the quick note. Before she could step outside to them, heavy boots crunched over her gravel driveway, Carol shouting her name loud enough to echo between the neighborings, her voice sharp and venomous with unfiltered rage. "Elena Mae Carter, get out here right now and take back this ridiculous, hurtful letter you left on our door." Carol planted herself dead center of the front, the discarded envelope fluttering to the grass, sheets of typed paper gripped in one trembling. "How dare you list every tiny slight from your childhood like we've spent our lives? We gave you a roof, food, college, and this is the repayment. You writing formal rules to lock us out of our own." Roger stood beside her, jaws hard, his gaze fixed on the front door, as if he intended to cross the lawn and push his way inside. Elena stepped onto the small front porch alone first, arms wrapped loosely around her torso to shield herself from the rising anger rolling off both of them, and she'd barely opened her mouth to respond when Jude's truck rounded the corner, tires kicking up loose gravel as he pulled into their driveway and jumped out to stand firm at her side, his broad frame positioned a clear barrier between Elena and her advanced parents, one hand resting light and protective on the small of her back, silent but unmistakable in his loyalty to his child. The second Jude positioned him beside her, Carol's fury spiked higher, and she waved the typed letter sheets through the air like evidence of some terror. "This man's turning you against your own blood. None of this nonsense would exist if you'd listened to your mother instead of letting him fill your head with lies about us." Elena shook her head, steady despite the tight ache in her ribs, and spoke clearly enough for both of them for every word, no longer holding back the weight of every wound she'd bared for decades. "Jude didn't plant these in my head. I lived every single one of them long before I met him. 14 years old with a fever so high I barely stand, and you chose bridge club over taking me to urgent care. My high school graduation dinner canceled, because you wanted to attend a neighbor's barbecue instead. 2 in active labor, water broken, begging you for a 10-minute riding center. And you told me to call a taxi so your steak dinner wouldn't be ruined. That letter only names the truth you've spent your whole life pretending." Roger shifted a step, his voice low and threatening, the first time Elena had seen his quiet, passive act to match Carol's hostility. "That labor night was one single nothing more. You're blowing it out of proportion to punish us. You were hurting, but we didn't think a little taxi ride would turn us for good." His admission hung thick in suburban air, a blunt confirmation they'd recognized her distress and chosen her own comfort anyway, and Elena felt hot tears at corners of her eyes, tears not of sadness, but of exhaustion. They'd known exactly how terrified and she'd been that night, and still they'd turned her thought. There was no misunderstanding, no accidental misjudgment, only a deliberate choice to put their convenience above their daughter's urgency. Carol caught the flicker of emotion on Elena's face, read it as surrender, stepping closer past Roger to press her case harder, the letter pages grasp. "We'll forget all this harsh writing if you scrap the visiting rules. Let us come over tomorrow to hold Lila without your husband over every minute. And stop talking about canceling the shower we paid good money to host. Otherwise we're done. No more family dinners, no more calls, no more pretending daughter who cares about us." Jude Elena's hip gently, a quiet signal she didn't have to negotiate under duress, and Elena lifted her unyielding. "I won't erase my boundaries, temporary affection, until you can acknowledge the harm you've caused me and commit to learning how to deal with kindness. We'll stay in place." Carol's face turned scarlet with rage, and Roger snatched the letter papers from her hand, balling them tight in his palm as he issued their final, non-negotiable ultimatum, deadline sharp and unforgiving. "You've got 48 hours to take back every word in that letter and send us a text saying you'll ridiculous demands. If we don't get message by Thursday evening, we're letting the shower venue deposit go to waste and cutting every last tie with you permanently. No softening. No flicker of remorse, no offer to sit talk through their trauma together, only an ultimatum, threats, and financial loss, designed to force Elena into submission before the 48-hour window closed. Roger turned and marched toward the pickup without another word, Carol casting one final hateful glare over her shoulder before climbing her seat beside him. The truck engine roared to life seconds later, tires spinning hard against the gravel driveway as they peeled away from the curb, leaving crumpled scraps of the boundary letter scattered front lawn in their wake. Elena leaned into Jude's side the second the blue pickup vanished around the street corner, his arm wrapping fully around her shoulders to steady her shaking frame, and she glanced back through the screen door toward the quiet nursery where Lila slept, unaware of the vision unfolding outside. The 48-hour deadline hung over her like a heavy storm cloud, 2 days to choose between surrender every safeguard she'd built for her daughter, her parents entirely. No middle ground remained, no small compromise to bridge the chasm between them, and Elena knew whatever choice she made when the clock ran out would reach the future irreversibly. Elena didn't waste a single hour of the 48-hour ultimatum window wallowing in indecision. The second her parents' blue pickup vanished around the neighborhood bend, Jude fetched a cardboard storage bin from the garage, clearing off the dining room table to build a tangible folder of proof against every lie and threat Carol and Roger had hurled at her over the past weeks. Sunlight slanted through the kitchen windows as they spread every piece of evidence across the oak surface, sorting them into neat, labeled stacks while Lila dozed peacefully in a portable bassinet pushed beside their chairs. First came printed screenshots of Carol's Facebook feed. Rows of generic stock infant photos captioned with fabricated stories of late-night feedings and labor bedside visits. All dated the full week Elena had been alone in the birthing center with only Jude by her side. Next were hard copies of every hostile group text, the inheritance threat Roger had sent to Jude's personal phone, and the shower venue deposit receipt Mara had forwarded over text after spotting it on Carol's kitchen counter during a distant family errand. They printed the photo of pink streamers and welcome grandbaby Lila banners Carol had sent as intimidation, alongside screenshots of Marnie's forwarded private messages twisting Elena's labor trauma into gossip for the entire Bennett bloodline. Elena tucked her dog-eared teenage journal into the back of the bin as well, its pages serving as long-term proof that the taxi abandonment had never been an isolated, one-time mistake, just the latest link in decades of emotional neglect. Halfway through sorting the paperwork, Elena pulled out her cell and dialed Mara's number, catching her nurse best friend between back-to-back postpartum patient checkups at the hospital. She asked Mara if she would be willing to write a formal witness statement detailing the clinic parking lot ambush. The night Elena arrived alone via rideshare in active labor, and every cruel remark Carol had shouted loud enough for hospital staff and strangers to overhear. Mara agreed without hesitation, promising to type up a signed, dated statement by that evening and send a scanned digital copy to Elena's inbox before her overnight shift began. That witness testimony would become a critical, neutral third-party account, stripping away Carol's ability to frame Elena as an unhinged, overreacting daughter with no outside validation of her suffering. As Jude stapled each stack of papers together and slid them into labeled manila folders, Elena's phone buzzed with an accidental mass text forwarded straight from Carol's device to her contacts. An entire guest roster for the neighborhood war, listing more than 70 names of neighbors, church acquaintances, extended cousins, and distant great. A short addendum at the bottom of the message laid bare her mother's final hit card, the last weapon Carol planned to wield if Elena refused to cave to the 48-hour. Every single guest had been instructed to ask public questions about why the baby had been hidden away, to collectively pressure Elena into apologizing and surrendering full grandparent access in front of the whole community. The shower was never just a celebration. It was a coordinated, pre-planned publication, a stage built to rewrite the story of Elena's labor and paint her as the villain of the family in front of every person Carol cared about. Elena sat back in her dining chair, staring at the lengthy guest list glowing on her screen, a cold sense of resolve settling deep. Carol had gambled everything on a public spectacle to erase guilt, banking on Elena's fear of neighborhood gossip to force. But with the full evidence folder assembled, witness testimonies way, and a clear record of every manipulated, Elena held the power to dismantle that performance before it ever unfolded. She and Jude huddled close over the hour, mapping out every step of their counter-move without resorting to unfair retaliation or unnecessary. Their goal: stop the public shaming before it began, without dragging Lila into the crossfire of Carol's social game. Once their quiet strategy was laid out, Elena opened the email address listed on the shower venue's rental contract Carol had printed and included in the tech attachments. She composed a calm, formal notice to the new manager, clearly stating that Carol Bennett had booked the private event without the consent of Lila, Carter's legal parent Elena and Jude, and that they revoked all option to host a baby shower under their infant daughter's name effective immediately. She attached copies of the deposit receipt, the mass guest list text proving Carol intended to use the event for public conflict, and a brief summary of the ongoing boundary dispute rooted in Carol abandoning Elena's labor, explaining that they would not allow their newborn to be used as a prop for a performance designed to spread false narratives to a crowd of strangers. She hit send on the email before the 48-hour window even halfway mark, her fingers steady on the mouse despite the faint tremor lingering from weeks of unrelenting stress. Less than 30 minutes later, a reply landed in her inbox from menu administrator. The message confirmed they had reviewed evidence, acknowledged the lack of parental consent for the child celebration, and notified Carol that the event scheduled 3 weeks out officially canceled. The non-refundable deposit Carol had paid months prior would be forfeited new policy, as the booking had been submitted under misleading pretenses without the approval. Elena read the confirmation email 3 times before sliding her phone table to Jude, the weight of Carol's biggest planned humiliation dissolving entirely from her shoulders. The balance of power tipped irreversibly. For weeks, Carol and Raj held all the leverage. Guilt trips, inheritance threats, family gossip, the looming threat of a public shower spectacle to damage a reputation. Now their last major play had been neutralized before it could ever happen, their ability to stage a neighborhood-wide showdown erased with a single email. Neutral relatives who'd only heard Carol's one-sided complaints had begun reaching out to Elena over the afternoon, asking to read the compiled evidence folder after word spread that the shower had canceled unexpectedly. More family members were slowly shifting away from loyalty to Carol, curious to hear the full, unedited truth of the labor night no one had bothered about before. Jude closed the lid on the full evidence bin and slid it beneath the dining table for safekeeping, wrapping her arm around Elena's waist as she glanced down the hallway at nursery. The 48-hour ultimatum still ticked kitchen wall clock, but the threat behind it had lost its sting. Carol and Roger no longer held the upper hand to shame, manipulate, or publicly putting her daughter. The mother's facade had crumbled, and the unavoidable fight was drawing near. One where Elena would hold every piece of proof needed, bear every lie, every threat, and every deliberate act of abandonment Carol and Roger had committed in 2 years. There would be no more hiding behind text messages, unannounced ambush, or neighborhood parties. Truth was fully gathered, and the moment to lay it all out in front of her parents was now inevitable. The sun hung low and honey gold over the quiet suburban street the morning the baby shower was originally supposed to take place, casting long, slanted shadows across Elena's front lawn. Jude had gotten up before dawn to move the full manila evidence bin out onto the wooden patio table beneath the backyard awning, spreading printed screenshots, witness statements, and dog-eared pages from Elena's teenage journal across the smooth surface in neat stacks. Lila was swaddled tight against Elena's chest in a soft knit carrier, her tiny head tucked against her collarbone, still dozing through the faint rustle of maple leaves overhead. Neither of them had to wait long before the familiar blue pickup truck rumbled down the road and crunched to a stop at the end of their driveway. Carol threw open the passenger door the second the engine cut off, her face tight and drained of its usual performative warmth, eyes blazing with unmasked fury. Roger followed slowly, shoulders hunched, hands stuffed deep in the pockets of his faded work jeans, carrying nothing but the crumpled venue cancellation printout clutched between his fingers. They marched straight past the flower beds lining the walkway, stepping onto the patio without invitation, and Carol's voice rose sharp enough to scare a flock of sparrows off the fence at the back of the yard. You canceled my shower behind my back, wasted hundreds of dollars in non-refundable deposits, and turned half the neighborhood against me with your fabricated complaints to the venue staff, she snapped, jabbing a finger toward the scattered papers spread across the table. All of this over one single night, where we didn't drop everything to drive you to the hospital. Can you even hear how ridiculous that sounds? Elena shifted slightly to cradle Lila more securely, her tone steady, stripped of the shaky vulnerability that had marked every earlier argument. She gestured to the stack of Facebook printouts nearest Carol's elbow first, rows of generic stock baby photos staring up from the paper. Before we talk about the shower, let's address the lies you've been feeding every neighbor and relative for weeks. These aren't pictures of life. You posted them online and claimed you sat with me through labor, held my baby hours after she was born, and stayed up through late-night feeding. None of that ever happened. You were at home eating steak while I waited 45 minutes alone for a ride, doubled over through contractions on my entryway. Carol's jaw tightened, and she reached out to sweep the printed photos aside, only for Jude to slide one hand across the table to hold the stack, his gaze calm, but unyielding. Don't touch the ends. Every screenshot is time-stamped, saved, and backed up in our email archive. Roger stepped forward then, unfolding the venue cancellation letter and waving it between them. We told you 48 hours to retract that ridiculous boundary letter, and instead you sabotaged the whole shower we'd spent months. We were going to introduce our granddaughter to everyone, and you took that chance away just to punish. This was never about introducing Lila to one, Elena lied, nodding toward the long printed guest list, tucked under Mara's witness statement. Every name on that roster was instructed to corner me with questions about why I'd hidden the baby away. You planned a public spectacle to spin your choice to abandon me in labor as a minor inconvenience, to paint me as ungrateful and cruel in front of 7 people. That's not a shower, Lila. It's a stage for your reputation. She reached past Carol to lift Mara's signed witness statement off the table next, unfolding the typed page to hold it up where both her parents could read every line. Mara was working the birthing wing then covered. She watched me arrive alone in a rideshare. She also saw you ambush me in the clinic parking lot weeks later, screaming accusations loud enough for patients and coworkers to watch. This is neutral third. No twisted family gossip, no secondhand stories from Marnie. Just a nurse who saw exactly how. Carol's composure cracked for the first time since stepping on the patio. Her lower trembled, and she glanced away from the statement driveway, her voice dropping from a shout to a strained. I posted those stock photos because embarrassed. The whole street was asking when they'd get to grandbaby, and I couldn't admit I'd left my daughter stranded in labor over a stupid dinner. I didn't mean to everyone. I just didn't want people judging me done. The quiet admission hung heavy from air, raw and unplanned, and Roger felt it beside her. No more sharp threats or gruff rebuttals ready on his tongue. Elaine's throat ached, but she did not saw her stance. Gesturing next to the dog-eared leather journal pages fanned out at the end of the table. The taxi incident wasn't a one-time mistake harassment. This journal tracks 32 years of you choosing your comfort over my pain. 14 years old with a dangerous fever, denied a ride to urgent care for bridge club. High school graduation dinner canceled for a neighbor's barbecue. Every crisis I faced growing up took second place to your plans. That night in labor was just the final thread that broke something I'd carried. Roger stared down at the handwritten entries. His brow furrowed as he scanned a few short paragraphs, and for the first time conflict began. There was no trace of defiance on his face, only quiet, stunned recognition of a pattern he'd never acknowledged before. He folded the venue cancellation letter and back into his pocket, abandoning the financial threat he'd wielded for weeks as leverage and Jude. Carol wiped a stray tear off her cheek with the back of her hand, but she did not offer a genuine apology, only a hollow, defensive compromise. Want from us, Elena? We can't erase that night. We can't take back the deposit we lost. Daughter. Elena lowered the witness statement back at the patio table, her hand brushing the soft curve of Lila's back through the carrier fat as she laid out her final, unnegotiable terms, the line that would define their relationship moving forward. I will allow limited sized visits with Lila, but only after fully met. First, both of you complete individual counseling to unpack why you've consistently prioritized your own convenience over my safety and well-being, my life. Second, I need a handwritten, honest apology that acknowledges exactly how much harm you caused I went into labor, and how your lifelong pattern of emotional neglect shaped the way I see our family. Till both of those things happen, there will be no visits, no calls focused on the baby, no attempts to rekindle our old broken dynamic. If you refuse these terms, all contact up entirely. Silence stretched over the backyard for long minutes, broken only by Lila's faint sleepy gurgles against Elena's chest and the distant hum of a lawnmower down the block. Carol glanced over at her, searching for support, but he only stared at the stack of evidence spread across the table, lost in quiet thought. No quick ultimatum or retaliatory threat to offer this time. All their leverage, gossip, inheritance threats, the planned shower humiliation, social media lies had been stripped away. They had no more power to manipulate Elena into abandoning her boundaries to spare their pride. Carol finally turned back to face Elena, her eyes glistening with a mix of lingering resentment. But she did not argue against the written apology. She reached out to grab Roger's arm, tugging him gently toward the driveway without a say in his conditions. They walked slowly back to the blue pit, their shoulders slouched, the fire of their anger fully extinguished by the weight of proof between them. Carol paused with one hand on the passenger car door and glanced back one last time at Elena, still standing on the patio with their granddaughter pressed close to her heart, surrounded by every piece of evidence that had unraveled her care-constructed grandmother facade. Then she climbed inside without a word, Roger following behind her, sputtered to life. They pulled away from the drive at a slow, defeated crawl. No spinning tires, no shouted parting insult, only quiet retreat. Ella leaned her head against Jude's shoulder. The second vanished around the street corner, his arm tight around her waist to steady her, as the tension of months of unrelenting conflict drained out of her body all at once. She looked down at Lila, still peacefully asleep in the carrier, and a heavy, unanswerable settled soft over her chest. Would her parents choose to work to heal the rift between them? Or would they walk away from their daughter and granddaughter rather than face the accountability therapy a sincere apology would demand? The final choice rests entirely with Carol and Roger now, and Elena knowing which path they would take. 3 weeks of quiet, unbroken peace settled over Elena and Jude's suburban home after the backyard confrontation, soft and steady in a way that felt almost unfamiliar after months of nonstop conflict. The constant buzz of angry texts, unannounced drives-by, family gossip phone calls, and looming shower humiliation threats had vanished completely. The neighborhood fell back into its usual gentle rhythm, morning bird calls through the oak trees, distant lawnmowers on weekends, and the quiet, sacred routine of raising a newborn without chaos hovering at the edges. Lila grew more alert by the day, her tiny smiles and soft coos filling the house with a lightness Elena had feared she'd never get to fully enjoy during her fragile postpartum months. Jude's overtime shifts finally ended, allowing him to be home each evening for bedtime feedings and quiet family nights, restoring the steady, safe partnership that had anchored Elena through her darkest days of isolation and betrayal. Mara's hospital schedule slowed down as well, and she stopped by twice a week with coffee and new baby supplies, sitting on the living room couch to laugh at Lila's new tiny expressions and validate how much strength Elena had summoned to protect her child and herself. For the first time since going into labor, Elena woke up each morning without a knot of dread tightening in her stomach, no waiting threat of family harassment hanging over her day. Mid-morning on a calm Saturday, Elena stepped out onto the front porch alone with a mug of warm chamomile tea, the autumn air crisp and mild against her cheek. A plain white envelope sat tucked beneath their welcome mat. No return address, no fancy handwriting, just the faint, familiar slant of her mother's script across the front. Her heart slowed, steady and cautious as she bent to pick it up, knowing instantly what it was. She carried the envelope inside and sat at the kitchen table, Lila resting peacefully in the rocking bassinet beside her while she tore open the seal. Inside was a short, typed letter signed by both Carol and Rob, clean and unemotional. No excuses, no deflection, no attempts to shift blame or minimize the harm they'd caused. They acknowledged abandoning her on labor night had been selfish and unforgivable, admitted their social media lies had been an act of cowardice to hide their own shame, and recognized their lifelong pattern of prioritizing their comfort over her well-being. They apologized plainly for the inheritance threats, the clinic ambush, the planned public shower humiliation, and every moment they'd chosen pride over their daughters. But the letter held a quiet, honest boundary of their own. They wrote that they had discussed individual therapy plans at length, but after speaking with a counselor, They knew they were not emotionally capable of fully unpacking their generational habits, nor delivering the deeply vulnerable, remorseful apology Elena truly deserved. They were willing to show up for limited supervised grandparents, but they could not become the self-aware, present parents and grandparents Elena had spent her whole life. They would try to better, but they would never be. And they would no longer pretend they could fix 32 years of neglect with a single apology or a few therapies. Elena read the letter twice, absorbing every unspoken truth between the lines. It was not the grand, tearful redemption she'd once secretly hoped for as a lonely child and hurting mother. There were no dramatic promises to change entirely, no desperate pleas for forgiveness, no sudden emotional. It was honest, unflinching reality. Her parents could offer basic civility and occasional but they would never offer the maternal and paternal love, safety, and validation she had spent her entire life craving. She walked down the hallway bedroom, knelt beside the floorboards, and pulled out her worn teenage journal. She flipped through the doggy pages, every sit alone, every abandoned stone, every quiet cry for help that had gone unanswered, and closed gently, tucking it onto the highest shelf of her closet for good. She no longer needed the journal to prove it was real. She no longer needed her parents' full to heal. She no longer needed their approval to know she was a good daughter, a worthy woman, and a fierce. That afternoon, she drafted a calm final reply text to Earl and Roger, laying out her permanent, long-term fix. Visits would happen every 2 weeks, always in her home, always Jude present. No ounce stops, no social media posting about Lila without explicit written permission, no rehabbing old fights, no guilt-tripping or pub performances. She told them she accepted their apology what it was, an honest acknowledgement of harm, and that how gentle, limited grandparent contact Lila's sake, but she would never again place her emotional healing or her daughter's safety in their hands. The broken parent-child bond of her childhood be repaired, but a new, quiet, respectful grandparent relationship exists for Lila, bounded and safe. 3 days later, Elena attended her final follow-up therapy session alone, closing out her postpartum trauma counseling with a full, grounded sense of peace. Her therapist confirmed what she'd come to her own. Healing did not require retaliation. She could honor her own pain, protect her child from emotional neglect, and still choose kindness for her parents without sacrificing herself. The cycle broken at last, not by fixing her parents, but by refusing to pass their emotional unavail to Lila. Late afternoon, Jude finished trimming the backyard hedges and Elena on the grass, sitting cross-legged beside her as she held Lila in her lap. The sun dipped golden and low over the rooftops, warm lights ling over the three of them, soft and unrushed. Lila blinked up at Elena with curious eyes, tiny fingers curling around her mother's thumb, completely unaware of the months of fighting, the endless stress and the hard, brave choices that had given her this safe, peaceful home. Elena head on Jude's shoulder, daughter breathe, and felt the last thread of her old childhood longing dissolve away. She had spent 32 years to choose her. Now she had chosen herself. She had chosen Lila. She had peace over performance, boundaries over approval, truth over fake family harmony. Her relationship with Carol Roger would never be warm, never be perfect, never be the loving parental bond she'd once ached for, but it would be safe. It would be quiet. It would be enough. The lonely, terrified girl who'd waited alone for a neighbor was gone. In her place stood a steady, strong mother who would never let her daughter feel abandoned or unprotected. Not for dinner plans, social reputation, not for anything. The old cycle had ended. A new life, soft and unbroken, had finally begun.